Most forests hide forgotten paths. This one hides an entire army. Deep in Eastern Europe, beyond abandoned villages and broken military roads, there is a forest that local people refuse to enter after sunset. They have given it many names over the centuries. The Whispering Woods, the Silent Border, the Forest of No Return. But every name carries the same warning. Do not follow the sounds. Do not answer the voices. And if you hear marching where no soldiers can be seen, leave immediately. The story began during one of the darkest periods of war. Thousands of trained soldiers were ordered to march through this forest. They carried weapons, supplies, horses, radio equipment, and enough food for several weeks. The route appeared on every military map. It was considered the fastest way to reach the next battlefield. The commanding officers expected the journey to take less than 2 days. The army entered just before sunrise. Witnesses watched the endless line of soldiers disappear beneath the trees. No one imagined they would never see them again. Hours passed, then a full day, then another. No radio messages arrived. No supply requests, no reports, no survivors. Search teams were immediately organized. Experienced scouts followed the same road into the forest. They expected to find signs of combat, broken equipment, destroyed vehicles, bodies. Instead, they found something far stranger. The road simply ended. Not physically. The trees were still there. The ground remained untouched. But every trail seemed to disappear into thick gray fog that should not have existed. The deeper they walked, the quieter the forest became. Birds stopped singing. Wind disappeared. Even their own footsteps sounded strangely distant. Some soldiers later claimed they felt as though the forest was listening, watching, waiting. The search teams called out for the missing army. Only echoes answered. Then something impossible happened. Several scouts reported hearing thousands of boots marching somewhere ahead. Perfect rhythm, perfect formation, an entire military column. Yet when they rushed toward the sound, nothing was there. Only trees, only silence. The officers dismissed the reports as exhaustion, stress, fear. But the strange events continued. Compasses slowly began turning in circles. Maps no longer matched the landscape. Roads appeared where none had existed. Familiar landmarks vanished. One search party walked in a straight line for hours. They somehow returned to the exact place where they had started. None of it made sense. Days later, a few soldiers finally emerged from the forest. There should have been thousands. Only a handful returned. Their uniforms were torn. Their faces were pale. Several could no longer speak. Others refused to sleep. When questioned, every survivor repeated the same sentence: "We were not alone." But they would say nothing more. Military investigators searched the forest again, then again, and again. They never found the missing army. No battlefield, no mass grave, no abandoned weapons, nothing. It was as though thousands of armed men had simply ceased to exist beneath the trees. Official reports quietly disappeared. Maps were updated. The incident slowly faded from public memory. But the people living near the forest never forgot, because on certain nights, when heavy fog covers the ground, they still hear thousands of unseen soldiers marching through the darkness. And some believe the army never truly left the forest. The official order was simple: cross the forest, reach the eastern valley before sunrise. The commanders believed the route would save nearly 2 days of travel. Speed meant survival. No one questioned the decision. At dawn, thousands of soldiers began marching beneath the ancient trees. At first, everything seemed normal. The road was narrow but clear. Sunlight slipped through the branches. The men laughed. Some sang old military songs. Others joked that the stories about the forest were nothing more than village superstition. The officers ignored every warning they had heard. To them, ghosts did not exist. Only enemies did. By midday, the atmosphere began to change. The temperature dropped without warning. A cold wind moved through the trees. Then it stopped completely. The silence that followed felt unnatural. No birds, no insects, no animals. It was as if every living creature had fled long before the soldiers arrived. One young private looked into the trees. For just a second, he thought he saw another column of soldiers. They were marching in perfect formation, keeping exactly the same pace, but they were deeper inside the forest, hidden between the trunks. He called to the others. When everyone looked, the figures were gone. The officers dismissed it as imagination. The march continued. Hours later, a dense fog rolled across the ground, not from the sky, It rose from beneath the trees. Within minutes, visibility dropped to only a few meters. The front of the column disappeared. Then the middle, then the rear. Thousands of soldiers were suddenly unable to see one another. Orders were shouted through the mist. Voices echoed strangely. Sometimes the commands sounded close. Sometimes they came from impossible directions. A captain called for the 2nd Battalion. A voice answered, but the reply came from somewhere behind him. The 2nd Battalion had been marching nearly a kilometer ahead. The officers exchanged nervous looks. Something was wrong. The radio operators tried contacting headquarters. Only static answered. Then, beneath the crackling noise, another sound appeared. Marching, slow, perfectly synchronized, followed by distant voices. The operators turned up the volume. The voices were speaking military commands, but not in any language the army recognized. One operator suddenly turned pale. He whispered that one voice sounded exactly like his father. His father had died years before the war. Moments later, the transmission ended, without explanation. As evening approached, strange landmarks began appearing. An old stone bridge stood, where no bridge existed on their maps. A broken watchtower overlooked a valley that should have been flat woodland. Ancient graves appeared beside the road. Some carried symbols no one could identify. Others were marked only with military helmets fused into solid stone. The army pressed forward. Turning back now would mean admitting fear. No commander was willing to do that. Then the first soldier disappeared. He had been walking beside 3 friends. 1 second he was there. The next, empty space. No scream. No footsteps. No struggle. Only his rifle lying across the road. Search parties spread into the trees. They called his name for nearly an hour. Nothing answered, except distant marching. By nightfall, more soldiers had vanished, always silently, always without leaving a single trace. The officers ordered everyone to stay close together. No one was allowed to leave the formation. No one was allowed to enter the forest alone. But the forest had already begun separating them. Because somewhere beyond the fog, something unseen was marching beside the army, and it was getting closer. Night fell far too quickly. One moment the sky was gray. The next, the forest was almost completely black. The officers ordered the army to make camp. Hundreds of lanterns were lit. Fires burned across the clearing. Thousands of armed soldiers surrounded the camp from every direction. It should have been one of the safest places in the country. Instead, every man felt exposed. The silence returned. No owls, no wolves. Not even the sound of wind moving through the branches. Then, just after midnight, a single whistle echoed through the trees. Every soldier froze. It sounded exactly like a military signal. One short blast, then another. The officers immediately stood. No one in their army had given the command. Another whistle answered from deeper in the forest. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of whistles surrounded the camp, perfectly coordinated. Like invisible officers were directing an unseen army. The soldiers grabbed their rifles. They searched the darkness. Nothing moved. The whistles stopped as suddenly as they had begun. For several minutes, everything was quiet. Then came the footsteps. Not one person, not 10. Thousands. Heavy boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. Left, right. Left, right. The sound circled the camp. It never came closer. It never moved farther away. It simply surrounded them. One frightened soldier fired into the darkness. The marching stopped instantly. The echo of the gunshot faded. Then every lantern went out at the same moment. The camp was swallowed by darkness. Men shouted. Officers screamed orders. Matches refused to light. Even the moon disappeared behind thick clouds. For nearly a minute, no one could see anything. Only breathing, only fear. Only the feeling that something was standing just beyond reach. When the lanterns finally returned, 5 soldiers were missing. Their blankets were still warm. Their rifles remained beside the fire. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no blood. It was as though they had simply vanished into the air. Panic spread through the camp. The officers ordered an immediate head count. More names were called. More silence answered. Not 5, not 10. 23 soldiers had disappeared during less than a minute of darkness. No one understood how it was possible. At sunrise, the army resumed its march. No one spoke. Every face carried the same expression: fear. As the column moved deeper into the forest, stranger things began to happen. Compasses spun wildly before stopping altogether. Pocket watches lost hours. Some stopped forever. Others ran backward. The maps became useless. Roads appeared where no road should exist. Entire hills vanished behind walls of mist. Several officers argued over which direction they had come from. Each one pointed to a different path. The forest no longer obeyed geography. Late that afternoon, the scouts reached a clearing. In the center stood hundreds of fresh military graves. Every cross carried the same date, tomorrow's date. The soldiers stared in disbelief. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else whispered that it had to be an enemy trick. Then one private found a grave with his own name carved into it. His hands began to shake. The birth date was correct. Even his military rank was correct. Only one detail remained unfinished. The date of death. It was blank. The officers ordered everyone away from the graves. No one argued. As they left the clearing, several men looked back. The crosses were gone. Only empty grass remained. That night, sleep became impossible. Because every few minutes, someone heard a voice calling their name from somewhere deep inside the forest. Always the voice of someone they loved. A wife, a brother, a mother, a child. Some voices begged for help. Others simply whispered, "Come find me." Before sunrise, the first soldiers began following those voices into the darkness, and not one of them ever returned. By the fourth day, the army no longer marched like an army. The perfect formation was gone. The long columns had broken apart. Groups became separated by walls of fog. Some wandered for hours before finding each other again. Others disappeared forever. No one knew how many soldiers were still alive. The officers tried to restore order. They shouted commands. They fired signal flares above the trees. The bright red light rose into the sky. Then it simply stopped. It hung motionless above the forest, as if something invisible had caught it. Seconds later, the flare went out. Darkness returned. The men stared in silence. No one could explain what they had just seen. As food and water began to run low, exhaustion took over. Some soldiers claimed they had not seen the sun for 2 days. Others insisted only a few hours had passed. Time itself no longer made sense. Then came the first survivor. A patrol discovered a young corporal sitting beside an old oak tree. His uniform was soaked with mud. His boots were torn apart. His rifle was missing. He did not react when they called his name. He simply stared into the trees. His hair had turned almost completely white. Only 4 days had passed since the army entered the forest. When the medics finally convinced him to speak, he whispered only one sentence. "They were marching beside us." Nothing more. Hours later, 2 more soldiers stumbled into the camp. One had deep scratches across his face. The other refused to let go of an empty military helmet. He carried it as though someone invisible was still wearing it. Both men repeated the same story. They had seen another army, not ahead of them, not behind them, beside them. The ghostly soldiers marched at exactly the same speed. Whenever the living stopped, the others stopped. Whenever the living marched, the shadows marched too. No sound except their footsteps. No faces beneath their helmets. Only darkness. The officers believed fear had broken their minds, but then, every survivor described the same detail, without speaking to one another. The ghost soldiers carried uniforms from different centuries. Some wore medieval armor. Others wore uniforms from forgotten kingdoms. Some carried muskets. Others held rusted swords. A few looked almost modern, as though they belonged to wars that had not happened yet. None of them attacked. None of them spoke. They simply marched, always in silence, always watching. One survivor finally revealed what had happened to his squad. Late at night, they heard someone calling for help. It sounded like one of their missing friends. They followed the voice into the trees. The cries grew louder, closer, then suddenly stopped. The forest became silent. They turned around. The path behind them had vanished. Their own footprints were gone. That was when they saw them. Hundreds of soldiers standing perfectly still between the trees, watching. No breathing, no movement, no eyes visible beneath their helmets. Only endless rows of silent figures disappearing into the darkness. The corporal raised his rifle. Before he could fire, every ghost soldier slowly lifted one hand and pointed deeper into the forest. Not as a threat, as an invitation. The survivors ran without looking back. Behind them, they heard thousands of boots begin marching again. Not toward them, around them, closing them inside a circle. When they finally escaped the forest, only 3 men remained. Their entire company had vanished. Military doctors questioned the survivors for weeks. Each interview ended the same way. The moment investigators asked what they had seen at the center of the forest, every survivor became completely silent. Some began crying, others covered their ears. A few begged never to be questioned again. One officer wrote a final note before resigning from the investigation. It contained only 8 words. Some places were never meant for the living. The military refused to abandon the investigation. Too many soldiers were missing. Too many families were waiting for answers. A second expedition was assembled. This time, the commanders chose only experienced veterans, men who had survived years of war, men who claimed they feared nothing. They entered the forest at sunrise. Unlike the First Army, they marked every tree they passed with bright red paint. If the forest was confusing, the markings would guide them back. It seemed like a perfect plan, until they turned around. Every painted mark had disappeared. The bark was untouched, as though no one had ever painted it. The officers checked the paint cans. They were nearly empty. The paint had been used, but it no longer existed on the trees. No one spoke. The march continued. Just before sunset, the soldiers reached a wide valley hidden deep inside the forest. It was completely silent. Not a single tree moved. Then a thick layer of fog drifted across the ground. Shapes slowly emerged from the mist. At first, they looked like ordinary men. Then the details became clear. Rows of soldiers, hundreds of them, then thousands, standing shoulder to shoulder, perfectly still. Their uniforms did not belong to one army. Some wore battered Roman armor. Others carried medieval shields blackened with age. There were Napoleonic infantry, cavalry from forgotten empires, soldiers from the First World War, and men in uniforms that looked disturbingly modern. Centuries of armies stood together. None of them spoke. None of them breathed. The veterans raised their rifles. Their commander shouted a warning. The ghostly figures did not react. Instead, every one of them turned their heads at exactly the same moment. Thousands of faces moved in perfect unison. The sound echoed like dry branches snapping. Some soldiers lowered their weapons. Others whispered prayers. Then the impossible happened. The ghost army began to march. Not toward the living, past them. Their boots struck the ground with perfect rhythm, yet the earth never shook. The figures passed through trees without touching them. They crossed fallen logs as though the obstacles did not exist. One frightened private reached out his hand. A ghost soldier walked straight through him. The young man collapsed to his knees. He later said, the air around the figure felt colder than ice, and for one brief second, he saw a battlefield that wasn't there. Burning villages, broken banners, thousands of bodies covering the ground. Then, the vision vanished. The ghost army kept marching. No one dared follow. No one dared interfere. The procession continued for nearly 20 minutes. Then, the fog swallowed every figure. The valley was empty again. Only silence remained. The expedition returned with a detailed report. Military headquarters rejected every word. The document was marked impossible. The commanding general ordered all references to ghost soldiers removed from the official record. The surviving witnesses signed secrecy agreements. Most never spoke publicly again. But one captain secretly kept a journal. Years after his death, the final page was discovered. It contained a sentence that investigators could never explain. They are not guarding the forest. They are trapped inside it. And if that was true, the next question was far more terrifying. What force could imprison entire armies for centuries, without ever letting them die? The captain's journal changed everything. Until then, investigators believed the forest was simply haunted. Now they began to wonder if the forest itself was a prison. Months later, a secret scientific expedition was approved. This time, the team included historians, archaeologists, geologists, radio specialists, and military engineers. Their mission was simple: reach the exact center of the forest. Discover why no army ever returned. The expedition entered with every modern instrument available: satellite maps, survey equipment, geological sensors, radio beacons. Every member wore a tracking device. For the first few hours, everything worked perfectly. Then, the failures began. One by one, the GPS receivers lost their signal. The radio beacons transmitted empty static. Battery levels dropped from full charge to 0 within minutes. Even mechanical watches stopped ticking. It was as if time itself had slowed. The team pressed forward. Near sunset, they found something no historical record had ever mentioned: an enormous circle of standing stones. Each stone stood nearly 4 meters high. They formed a perfect ring in the middle of the forest. No roads led there. No villages existed nearby. No one knew who had built them. The surfaces were covered with symbols, unlike any known language. Some resembled stars. Others looked like human figures with antlers. Many had been worn smooth by thousands of years of rain. Yet a few carvings looked almost new, as if someone had etched them only days before. The archaeologists photographed every symbol. Later, they discovered something impossible. The symbols changed position in different photographs. No two images matched exactly. No camera had captured the same arrangement twice. The researchers blamed damaged equipment, until every camera produced the same impossible result. Night approached. The team decided to camp beside the stone circle. Just after midnight, a low vibration rose from beneath the ground. Not loud, not violent. It felt like a heartbeat beneath their feet. Slow, steady, ancient. Then came the whispering. At first, no one could understand the words. The voices seemed to come from every direction, from the trees, from the wind, from beneath the earth itself. The linguists began recording the sounds. Hours later, they replayed the audio. The whispers had vanished. The recordings contained only silence. One young researcher walked toward the center of the stone circle. The others watched him stop. He tilted his head, as though listening to someone standing directly in front of him. Then he smiled. Without saying a word, he stepped into the middle of the circle. A wall of thick fog rose around him. For 3 seconds, he remained visible. Then the fog cleared. He was gone. The ground beneath the circle was untouched. There were no footprints, no hidden tunnel, no sign that anyone had ever stood there. The team searched until sunrise. Nothing. One person had simply ceased to exist. The remaining investigators packed their equipment. No one wanted to stay another night. As they hurried away, one historian looked back. He later swore that every stone in the circle had turned slightly. Not much, just enough to face the path the team was using to escape. As though the monument had watched them leave. The expedition officially failed. No explanation was ever given for the missing researcher. His name quietly disappeared from government records. Years later, classified documents revealed one final detail that had never been released to the public. Beneath the oldest stone, ground-penetrating scans detected a massive hollow chamber. Far too large to be natural, no excavation was ever approved. Because the moment the scanners mapped its outline, they detected something else. Thousands of human-shaped figures, standing perfectly still, deep beneath the forest floor. The underground discovery was never announced. Every report was marked classified. The military sealed the forest. New fences appeared around the old roads. Warning signs claimed the area contained unexploded wartime explosives. That explanation satisfied most people. But not everyone. A small group of researchers refused to let the mystery die. They believed the government was hiding something far older than war. Using old maps, forgotten journals, and satellite photographs, they discovered an unsettling pattern. The missing army was not the first. It was not even the 10th. For more than 1,000 years, records described people entering the same forest and never coming back. Roman scouts, medieval knights, royal hunting parties, merchants, pilgrims, even entire villages that attempted to settle near its edge. Different centuries, different nations, the same outcome. Disappearance. The researchers requested permission to reopen the investigation. Their request was denied, so they entered the forest in secret. Unlike the military, they carried no weapons, only cameras, notebooks, audio recorders, and drones. The first day passed without incident. The second day brought the fog. On the third morning, they launched a drone above the trees. For a few seconds, the video feed was clear. Then the image began to distort. Dark figures appeared between the trees. Hundreds of them, standing in perfect rows. The drone climbed higher. The figures became easier to see. Then every one of them looked up, directly at the camera. The signal immediately failed. When the drone was recovered later that afternoon, its memory card contained only static, except for one single frame, a blurred image. Rows of soldiers standing in formation, their faces hidden. One figure stood at the front. Unlike the others, it appeared to be looking directly into the camera. Its eyes reflected the light. But there was no face behind the helmet, only darkness. That night, the researchers heard marching again. This time it was different. The footsteps stopped outside their camp. No one spoke. No branches moved. The silence lasted nearly 5 minutes. Then every tent zipper slowly opened, on their own. One by one, the researchers rushed outside. The camp was empty. Nothing surrounded them. Yet fresh footprints covered the ground. Thousands of them. Every print pointed toward the heart of the forest. None pointed away. By sunrise, one researcher was missing. His backpack remained beside the fire. His notebook lay open. Only one sentence had been written during the night. They finally know we're here. The remaining team abandoned the expedition. As they reached the forest's edge, they looked back one final time. Far between the trees, hundreds of pale figures stood silently watching. They did not move. They did not chase anyone. They simply waited. When the researchers blinked, the figures were gone. Months later, intelligence officials quietly collected every photograph, recording, and notebook from the expedition. Most of the material disappeared into government archives. But one classified document survived. It contained a chilling conclusion. The phenomenon is not expanding. It has been waiting for something or someone, and no one knew whether that waiting was finally coming to an end. Years passed. The forest remained closed. Officially, it no longer existed as a place of mystery. It was simply a restricted military zone. But history has a habit of leaving clues. One historian spent decades searching through forgotten monasteries, abandoned castles, and dusty national archives across Europe. He was not looking for ghosts. He was looking for records. And eventually, he found them. The oldest document dated back nearly 2,000 years. It described a Roman scouting party that entered a dense forest after pursuing an enemy force. More than 500 soldiers disappeared before sunset. The final line of the manuscript read, "The trees accepted them, but never returned them." At first, the historian dismissed it as folklore. Then he uncovered another account. This one came from the Middle Ages. A king had sent hundreds of armored knights into the same woodland after reports of strange lights appearing every night. Only one horse returned. Its saddle was empty. Its armor was covered in frost, even though it was the middle of summer. Over the following years, the historian found more accounts. A regiment from the Napoleonic Wars, an imperial patrol, a group of resistance fighters during the Second World War, the missing army from modern history, different nations, different centuries. Yet every report described the same details. A cold mist, voices calling familiar names, marching where no soldiers could be seen, and an endless line of silent figures deep within the trees. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The historian placed every disappearance on a timeline. A pattern slowly appeared. The events were not random. They occurred at almost identical intervals, roughly every 100 years, always during late autumn, always after several nights of unusually heavy fog. It was as if the forest followed a schedule, as though something beneath it awakened only at certain times. The discovery attracted the attention of a retired military officer. He secretly shared a classified map that had never been released. The map showed every recorded disappearance. When the historian connected the locations with straight lines, a perfect symbol appeared, the same symbol carved into the ancient stone circle. No one could explain why. Geologists examined the area. They discovered enormous underground caverns stretching beneath the forest. Natural formations could explain the hollow spaces, but they could not explain what happened next. During one seismic survey, the instruments detected movement. Not an earthquake, not collapsing rock. Movement. Thousands of separate signals, walking, slowly, in perfect formation, deep below the surface. The scientists repeated the scan. The movement had stopped. They searched for another explanation. Equipment failure, electrical interference, human error. Nothing fit the evidence. One engineer quietly admitted something he never included in the official report. The underground movement matched the exact rhythm of military marching. Left, right, The same rhythm witnesses had reported for centuries. The same rhythm heard by every expedition. The same rhythm that echoed through the forest on nights of heavy fog. The historian published his findings. Within days, the book disappeared from stores. Its publisher claimed it had never been printed. Digital copies vanished from online archives. The historian refused to discuss the case again. Before his death, he gave one final interview. He looked directly into the camera and said, "History says they disappeared. The evidence says they never left." If he was right, then the greatest mystery was no longer what happened to the army. It was who, or what, was still keeping them there. For generations, People have tried to explain the forest. Some believed it was haunted. Others insisted there had to be a scientific answer. After centuries of disappearances, no theory has explained every piece of evidence, but each one reveals part of the mystery. The first theory is the oldest. The Ghost Army. According to local legends, every army that vanished became trapped inside the forest, unable to leave, unable to die, forced to march forever. Supporters of this theory point to one unsettling detail. Witnesses from different centuries describe the same silent soldiers. They wore uniforms from different eras, yet they all marched together. The witnesses never knew one another. Many lived hundreds of years apart. Still, their descriptions were almost identical. The second theory is the cursed battlefield. Historians believe the forest may have been the site of an enormous forgotten war. Not one battle, many, over thousands of years. Perhaps so much violence left something behind. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, but an echo, a memory that keeps repeating itself, like voices trapped inside an old recording. This could explain the phantom marching, the mysterious whistles, the cries for help, and the strange visions reported by survivors. The third theory is even stranger. Some physicists have suggested that certain places may contain unusual geological conditions capable of affecting human perception. Magnetic anomalies, underground minerals, natural electrical fields. In theory, these could interfere with compasses, radios, and even the human brain. That might explain why people become disoriented, why they lose track of time, why they believe they hear voices. But there is one problem. Magnetic fields cannot erase thousands of people. They cannot remove footprints. They cannot explain entire military units disappearing without a trace. The fourth theory is the most unsettling. A place where time overlaps. Imagine different centuries existing in the same location for brief moments. Roman soldiers, medieval knights, modern armies, all crossing the same forest. At different points in history, yet somehow seeing one another. Supporters of this theory believe the stone circle may act as the center of this phenomenon, a place where time folds in on itself. It sounds impossible, yet some witnesses describe seeing uniforms that had not been invented. Others reported ancient warriors walking beside modern troops. No theory completely explains that. Then there is the final possibility, the one almost no one wants to discuss. What if the forest is alive? Not alive like an animal, alive in a way we do not understand. A place that remembers, a place that chooses, a place that refuses to release those who enter too far. There is no scientific evidence proving this, only stories, centuries of stories. But those stories refuse to disappear. Even today, modern hikers continue reporting the same experiences. Cold fog arriving without warning, footsteps with no source, voices calling their names, and rows of silent figures standing between the trees before fading into darkness. Whether these reports are supernatural experiences, misunderstandings, or something else remains unknown. No explanation has been universally accepted. Every answer seems to create even more questions. Perhaps that is why the mystery has survived for so long. Because every person who tries to solve it leaves with a different theory, and none of them can prove they are right. Which leaves one final question. If the forest is still keeping its secret, what would happen if someone tried to uncover it? One last time? The investigation never truly ended. It simply became quieter. Official files were sealed. Witnesses grew old. Researchers passed away. The world moved on. But the forest remained exactly where it had always been, waiting. Today, satellite images show nothing unusual. From above, it looks like any other stretch of woodland. Endless trees, narrow trails, shadows beneath the canopy, nothing that could explain centuries of disappearances. And yet, those who live nearby still avoid it. They do not need official warnings. The stories passed from one generation to the next are enough. Parents tell their children never to follow strange voices. Hunters refuse to stay after sunset. Even experienced hikers turn back when the fog begins to rise. Not because they have seen ghosts, but because they know what others have claimed to see. Every few years, another story appears. A camper reports hearing synchronized footsteps outside a tent. A photographer captures distant figures that cannot be identified. A hiker follows what looks like a military trail, only to discover it ends in untouched forest. Most of these reports remain unverified. Some may have ordinary explanations. Others remain mysteries. That is the nature of places like this. Facts and folklore become difficult to separate. What we do know is simple. Across centuries, multiple accounts describe remarkably similar experiences: unexplained fog, strange sounds, disorientation, and the feeling of being watched. Whether these reports point to a supernatural force, unusual natural conditions, or the power of legend is still unknown. No investigation has produced a definitive answer. No excavation has uncovered the missing armies. No official report has solved the mystery. Perhaps the forest is only a forest. Perhaps fear causes people to see what they expect to see. Or perhaps there are places in this world that still refuse to surrender their secrets. Places where history and legend have become impossible to untangle. If that is true, then somewhere beneath those ancient trees, the answer still waits. Not in a forgotten document, not in an abandoned bunker, but inside the silence itself. Because if even one witness told the truth, if even one report was accurate, then thousands of missing soldiers were never destroyed. They were simply never allowed to leave. So the next time you see a forest covered in thick morning fog, and you hear distant footsteps where no one should be, ask yourself one question. Are you listening to an echo from the past, or is someone still marching? The truth is that no verified evidence has ever confirmed a paranormal explanation for this story. The legends remain legends. The disappearances remain unsolved where documented. And the mystery endures because the final answer has never been found. Sometimes the most terrifying stories are not the ones we can prove. They are the ones we cannot explain. The forest is still there. The silence is still there. And whatever the truth may be, it has kept its secret for centuries.